Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Life After Deconstruction podcast. I'm super excited to share with you today the presentation that I gave at the July 2022 Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium titled Thriving and Building Community After a Faith Crisis. It is a Sunstone version of my TEDx talk from March of 2022, where I added a few things, subtracted a few things, and it was followed by a question and answer session. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Thank you. So in June 2020, in the midst of COVID, an organizing committee decided to do TEDx billings. And the lead organizer approached me, messaged me, and asked me if I would be willing to contribute in some way, maybe even as a speaker. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to contribute. That would be very meaningful to me. I've been a financial planner for more than 3 decades. I can talk about financial behavior and how that affects decisions. I primarily work with retired people. I can talk about what people experience in retirement and deciding what to do with their kids and grandkids and snowbirding and things like that. I said, I also went through an existential faith and identity crisis about 4 years ago. And what came out of that is I created a support group to help other people who are processing similar things. And he said, the last one is the interesting one. He said, actually, the theme of our TEDx billings this time is about building and supporting our community. So what you have to talk about absolutely fits into what we want to do. So I spent the following weeks, months, and years, because it got delayed because of COVID, writing my talk. I spent hours and hours writing my talk. And as most of us do, I wrote the talk in a less personal way, describing epistemology, boring things, the illusory truth effect, confirmation bias, enmeshment with identity, existential crisis, the importance of active listening and healing from trauma. And I wrote this talk, and earlier this year, as it got closer to the time to present the talk, I shared it with a few of my friends. Inside and outside of activity of the church. And one friend in particular had the courage to tell me, Anthony, this is a little bit bullshit. He said, that isn't going to do what you need to have done. You need to take the courage to hold people by the hand and walk them through the experience. Don't say you experience disassociation and suicidal ideation. Walk them through what that is. So with about a month to go, after all the training and drafts that I had sent to my organizing committee, I scrapped it all and I rewrote my talk with help from this friend and other friends that drew out of me what my TED Talk became: to walk a stranger through the experience. I also modified my TED Talk to make it more universal. In fact, I only used the word Mormon in the very first sentence. So on March 5th, I gave my TED Talk. And on May 13th, it came out on Facebook. And what I decided to do today is change it up a little bit. Instead of showing you video of my TED Talk, because I'm going under the understanding that probably most of you have seen the YouTube version of it. And if you haven't, you can just Google Anthony Miller TED Talk and watch it. I'm going to give you the Sunstone version of my TED Talk. It'll be a little bit different. And then afterwards, we'll talk about the kinds of responses that I had, and then we'll do a Q&A. So here it is. My parents joined the Mormon Church when I was 3 years old in Phoenix, Arizona. We were poor. My father had a difficult time providing for us. We were used to being evicted. But our church community took care of us. You know how sometimes church congregations adopt a family for Christmas because otherwise that family wouldn't have a Christmas? That was our family. My parents divorced when I was a teenager. My father struggled to provide support. So as the oldest of 4 children, I mowed lawns and delivered pizza.
while my mother did sewing and alterations out of the little old modified farm shack of a house we lived in. And we felt grateful for months when we only had to rely on our church for help with just food. My church gave me friends, community, and role models. It gave me hope of what a stable family could look like. As a 19-year-old, I served 2 years as a full-time missionary in Barcelona, Spain, as I dedicated 60 to 70 hours each week striving to bring people unto Christ through baptism and confirmation. I had many spiritual experiences. As I taught, prayed, contemplated scriptures, and performed ordinances like baptisms, I sensed a deep connection in my heart. Love, peace, joy, the fruits of the Spirit, a swelling warmth in my being. I attributed meanings to these experiences as if they were metaphorical vines that I intertwined around my heart. The primary meaning was that these experiences were from God, giving me reliable divine witnesses of the truthfulness of the things I was teaching and reading, and that I was doing God's work. Approaching the end of my mission, I found myself in a deep internal struggle. I needed to know for sure whether the offering of my mission was acceptable to God. So I fasted and I prayed for several days, pleading in prayer for an answer. Then one day, I found myself sitting on a couch in a small, humble apartment living room of a family we had recently taught and baptized, where I felt like I received my sacred answer from God. The wife of the family asked me to read her journal entry of the day of her baptism. And as I read it, I felt a softening in my chest, a warmth in my heart. Tears began to stream down my face as almost audible words came to me that for me, the purpose of this life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others, and that whether or not my mission was an acceptable offering was the wrong question, because that was about me instead of about God and others. Our ministering presence to this humble family in their time of spiritual need, once strangers, but now holding hands as brothers and sisters in Christ, amplified that gratitude in my being. With this experience, I attributed additional vines and layers of meaning around my heart, that my church was true, that I was the child of a God who loved me, and I knew my place in the universe. For the following 3 decades of my life, I had many experiences like these. For example, as a Sunday school teacher in preparing my lessons, I prayed to God that I could be an instrument in His hands to touch the lives of my class members. On Sundays, with a prayer in my heart, I greeted those class members as they entered the room. And I often felt led by God in the things that I taught. Many times, members approached me after class to express that they really needed specific things that were part of that day's discussion, sometimes even as answers to their prayers. I experienced a constant positive feedback loop of these kinds of experiences, and also serendipitous experiences that happened during my life, for which I continually intertwined and interlayered additional vines and layers of meaning. Nonetheless, the primary meaning was that these spiritual experiences represented reliable divine witnesses of the truthfulness of my church and its teachings. Now, I should say that over the years, I encountered many things that threatened my testimony and triggered significant dissonance for me. Things like conflicts in scriptures that I couldn't reconcile, or problematic teachings from church leaders that violated my conscience, things that I couldn't reconcile with what I understood about science and history. I applied critical thinking to other areas of my life, but with regard to my faith, I set those difficult, irreconcilable, dissonance-causing things aside, as if books on a metaphorical shelf, in faith that God would provide me further light and knowledge about them someday. However, over time, my shelf grew massive. It was heavy-laden and sagging. Nonetheless, the cumulative intertwined vines and layers of meaning around my heart had grown into my heart, giving me such a sense of certainty that it prevented me from allowing my metaphorical shelf to collapse. My beliefs, my roles, my reputation, my community, my family connections, how I made sense of life, were all completely enmeshed in these intertwined vines and layers of meaning around my heart that eventually grew to become one with my heart. Then, 6 years ago, our 22-year-old son came out to us as gay. In my church, the only valid path for him would be to live a completely celibate life, painfully absent comprehensive love, or to live in a mixed orientation marriage, also without full capacity for comprehensive love for him or for his wife. Deep in my heart, the God I knew wouldn't want my son to live a life painfully absent. I wasn't going to get emotional. The kinds of comprehensive intimacy and love that my wife and I share, I couldn't metaphorically shelf that depth of cruelty as coming from the God I knew. So that evening, I anxiously searched online for resources as to how a believer could support a gay son. In my search, on my church's website, I accidentally stumbled across what are called the church history gospel topics essays that discuss difficult topics that I had always been led to believe were anti-church lies. As it turns out, they weren't lies. They were just history. I consumed the balance of my church's 13 essays that evening, and with that information, I recognized that many of my treasured spiritual experiences had confirmed the truthfulness of many partially or entirely false things as I understood them. It also seemed to me that during my church's history, its leaders routinely lacked the capacity to discern between their own biases and prejudices and actual inspiration from God. The deepest meanings that I attributed to my spiritual experiences as reliable divine witnesses of truth hadn't only proven false for me, but it also seemed to prove false for the leaders of my church too. Also that evening, I learned that the leaders of my church knew this information, and in order to protect faith, they chose to exclude it from lesson manuals, often taking retributive actions against scholars who published about it. This violated my core values. More painfully, though, I recognized that my spiritual experiences weren't what I thought they were. These recognitions shattered my heavy shelf. All the cumulative decades of dissonance and irreconcilable problems I had accumulated lie in a pile of scattered broken pieces on the floor. Also in those moments, all the cumulative intertwined vines and layers of meaning that had grown around my heart, into my heart, and become one with my heart were abruptly and violently ripped from me, leaving in my heart a bloody, shredded, tangled mess. My identity became an empty void. The heavens closed, and it was as if the God I had always known never existed in the first place, notwithstanding my cries out to him in those very moments. I later learned that what I experienced that night is often referred to as the dark night of the soul. But for me, it was more than one night. For the following 3 days, with almost no sleep, I consumed large volumes of information to try to make sense of what I had discovered. I anxiously tried to figure out how to make the church true again. But the more I studied, the less true it became for me. For the following weeks, I spent hours and hours in prayer, pleading with God for help. And nothing. I spent hours and hours in scriptures. I counseled with my church leader, and he gave me a formal priesthood blessing, and nothing. I spent hours and hours each day reading church apologetics and listening to podcasts to try to make sense of things. During those weeks, I cried myself to sleep most nights. My wife sometimes found me ugly crying in our bed. And she enveloped me in her arms to console me. The dissonance was soul-crushing. Sometimes it hurt to breathe. One day after having attended church, my heart raced, and the pain was so severe that I laid down on our bedroom floor with my hands on my chest to try to slow my breathing. And overwhelming thoughts came to me that if I could just stop breathing, maybe the pain could end. My mind instantly hatched a plan of how to make the pain end without leaving the mess for my wife so that she wouldn't have to sell our home. It terrified me. I didn't feel like myself, like I was a hollow person. I didn't fully recognize the person in the mirror. Maybe that's why God wouldn't answer me. Am I even the same person? With all the anguish of my soul, God, I need you. Help me. There had to be someone. Where were they? Then one day, I stumbled across a Facebook support group that might be able to help me. It used to be called A Thoughtful Faith. And with vulnerability, I introduced myself. And like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, with me as the wounded traveler, hundreds of those people reached out through the internet to hold me in my grief. It just so happened that a member for that group named Lindsay Hanson Park was visiting her best friend in Billings, Montana at 9:57. She messaged me and invited me to breakfast the next morning. So the next morning, I sat with Lindsay and I shared my full story in person for the very first time with someone who could fully hold it. And like a good Samaritan, Lindsay held my story as if it were the most important she had ever heard, even though she had heard hundreds like mine. Lindsay didn't try to fix me. She didn't tell me I was wrong. There were no attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, just a grace and ministry of presence. Lindsay assured me, you've got this. You've got all the tools. It feels like you're sinking in quicksand, but you're actually standing on solid ground. The grief you feel is what will burn the ground to prepare for new growth, and you get to decide what that is. And somehow, I believed Lindsay, and she gave me a temporary reprieve from my 7-week-long dark night of the soul. I later learned that Brene Brown refers to what Lindsay did as the ministry of presence, or holding the hand of a stranger. I didn't know this at that time. All I knew is that what I experienced with Lindsay is something that needed to exist in the world. And whatever it was, not only did I need more of it, I needed to be a part of it. What she did hinted ever so slightly at that moment of grace from my mission. That answer, that gratitude, the holding hands. About a month after I met with Lindsay, I traveled to Salt Lake City to the 2016 Sunstone Symposium. And before that, I went to a program and a dinner with members of that group where she found me. After the program and dinner, I asked my new friend, Jerilee Renshaw, will I feel it again? Will I feel God again? She said, I don't know, Anthony. Everyone's journey is different, but regardless, we are here for you. The next day, I attended a faith crisis support workshop with Gina Colvin and Thomas McConkie and John DeLinde. And for the balance of the week, I attended the Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium, going to every session I could related to what I had been experiencing. And I found more people just like me. And I found more of that ministering presence, strangers who held my hand, and they held me in their arms just like Lindsay did. Jody England Hansen, Kimberly Anderson, Bill Reel, and many others. During that week, as my heart began to heal from the trauma, I began to feel that transcendent connection and grace in my being once more. But it was too triggering to call it for God, so I didn't intertwine any vines or layers of meaning to it. I drove home from that week 6 years ago, completely out of my 3-month-long dark night of the soul. I wished that my church community could have done for me what that week did for me, but they couldn't. I soon discovered that I wasn't alone in Billings, Montana. Several of my friends were actually traversing the same thing I was. So I created a support group that continues to grow to this day. In our group, we've each put in significant work to try to understand what happened to us, and we support each other with grace in a ministry of presence. In our group, we support each other across the entire spectrum of belief, without any agenda of where our individual faith journeys will end. Members of our group, regardless of what we each leave behind or the depths of the unknown we have traversed, as we each step forward into human experience with exploration and discovery, we are not alone. Well, for me, my process is ongoing, and there are scars. With the help of others, my heart has healed. For me, my choice, rather than rush to attribute and intertwine new vines and layers of meaning, I choose to allow my transcendent, connecting, grace-filled experiences to exist in their purity, approaching them with curiosity and with gratitude. This work of supporting others, it's how I thrive now. In some ways, it connects back to that moment, half a world away, sitting on a couch, reading that journal entry. I strive to live my life with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others, with grace, with ministering presence, and to hold the hands of strangers. Thank you. So I said a lot of F-bombs as I was writing this. Yeah. Because I recognize that even 6 years later, there were things that I hadn't fully processed. I was fearful that I would get so emotional on stage that people wouldn't be able to understand what I was saying. As I was writing, my wife would sometimes come downstairs and see me weeping and go, "Oh, you're right, you're working on your talk. I'll leave you alone." And I prepared myself for an extreme vulnerability hangover, because this is the most vulnerable thing I think I've ever done in my life. After my talk, the majority of the audience never have been Mormon at all, because it's in Billings, Montana. Active membership of the church maybe is 3%. One of the first people that came up to me on the break was a woman. She wrapped her arms around me and with tears said, "I grew up in a very conservative Baptist congregation, and I've been in a very physically abusive marriage. And I eventually gained the fortitude to divorce my spouse. But in our church, divorce is forbidden except for adultery. So not only does I lose my marriage, I was shunned from my congregation, and my parents are part of that congregation. And that was enough to crash my shelves. And I'm in the dark night of the soul." And I feel seen by you. One of the next that came up to me was a teenager that the TEDx Billings gave tickets to high schoolers so they could go and see some of the talks. And this teenager came up to me and wrapped their arms around me and with tears said, "Anthony, I'm in deep faith crisis. I'm in the dark night of the soul, and my parents have forbidden me to access the internet because they said it was Satan that caused my lost belief. and I don't know what to do, but I feel seen. Thank you. With those two discussions, there was no vulnerability hangover. If my talk was only for those people, it was worth it. In the coming days and weeks, many non-members, never members, came out of the woodwork and messaged me, called me to express that they felt seen. Maybe their existential crisis was religious-based, or maybe it was just the woman who was in her 40s who said, I always thought God's plan for me was to get married and have kids with the white picket fence. And now that I'm in my 40s, I see that I'm not going to have kids, that this isn't going to happen. And you gave voice to my existential crisis. So that was very, very meaningful to me. I shared a version of my TED Talk before it came out on YouTube with several post-Mormon groups. And I had one woman in particular that expressed, thank you so much for sharing and walking people through the experience of disassociation and suicidal ideation. If you had just used those words, it wouldn't have meant the same. But you gave voice to my experience. She said that from my faith crisis, I've had multiple hospitalizations. And I feel seen. Just earlier this week, I have a post-Mormon who's in the early months of his faith transition. And he's in that anger stage. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. I did. But he's in it. And he had this super close relationship with his father, who's a very orthodox, literalistic, active-believing Mormon. And in his raging and in his interactions with his father, he lost that relationship during these last 6 months. And a little bit over a week ago, he sent my TEDx talk to his dad and said, this man explains what I experienced. These are words that I don't have to express, but this was my experience. Would you please listen to this? Within a half an hour of sending it, his dad called him and said, I am so sorry. I need to repent. I didn't know that's what you experienced. And within a week, their relationship was restored. He said, I know you probably get lots of things like this, but I just wanted to share with you my story. And every one of those is a treasured moment to me. Those are transcendent connecting experiences for me. And I received responses from active believing members too. One man who's an attorney who lives in Texas found me on LinkedIn, connected with me so he could message me, and he said, Brother Miller, thank you so much for your TED Talk. I'm so sorry how you were treated, but your TED Talk helped me understand my son better, and I'm grateful for you. One experience is one thing that led through a long story that I won't share, but I have a friend who's a fair Mormon apologist who lives in southern Utah. And our relationship started out polemic, and we became friends over time because I shared my story with him instead of debated the weeds of the things. And we became friends. And after my TEDx talk came out on YouTube, I did a Mormon Stories episode where I discussed it. And this man who's a fair Mormon apologist, his wife is a former, was in the polygamist groups at Short Creek. She's now a member of the LDS Church. And his name is Ken. And Ken messaged me because I mentioned his name in my Mormon Stories episode as someone who really helped me get to where I could be to share this TEDx talk. And it meant a lot to me. Ken messaged me after my episode, and he says, "You're never going to guess what happened. My mother-in-law is in deep existential faith crisis, leaving this polygamous group south of St. George. And she's in the dark night of the soul. And she told me she was watching this man on Mormon Stories that was really helping her process her faith crisis. And she mentioned Ken. Is that you? Do you know Anthony?" Like, that's a pretty serendipitous moment, right? That this initially polemic relationship became a friendship that helped me give this talk that is now giving relief to his mother-in-law who's in faith crisis. So I've had many positive responses, including from family members that have expressed appreciation that this helped them understand better. All of this has been very humbling. So, in any event, there are many, many stories of how people have responded, but I wanted to share some of those with you. So it looks like we have a little bit of time to do Q&A. Actually, we have quite a bit of time.
I'll just say a statement. I'm going to use that tomorrow in my talk. I'll quote you.
Thank you. Ex-Mormon Anthony Miller.
No, it would just be Anthony Miller.
Anthony Miller, thank you. Not the apostate. Okay.
I was just wondering if you received negative feedback, because I know in this space, people with faith crisis, they want to kind of lead people back to full belief.
Yeah.
But I mean, I know I watched your TED Talk, and I would think you wouldn't get any negative because it was just from your heart. But I was just curious if you had.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I mean, from believing Mormons, there's really only one negative feedback that I got, and it's from an apologist. And he said, "Anthony, it's clear that you don't have peace in your life, because otherwise you wouldn't have gotten that emotional in your talk. You need to come back to the church so you can have peace in your life." And I'm like, "Dan, it's not Dan Peterson. It's a different Dan." I said, "Dan, I relived some of the trauma on the stage. That's what you saw. It's not that I don't have peace in my life." But I had many very, very orthodox, including apologists, express appreciation for it. In fact, Ken, his last name is Peterson. He would be fine if I shared that. Ken Peterson's response was, "Anthony, people need to be ministered to on the outside of the edge. And those are things that me and many others can't do. And what you're doing is God's work," is what he said. And that means a lot to me.
So that was also going to be my question is, do you still believe in God, or have you joined another religious, whatever you want to call it, cult or group or...
I'm here, am I? Yeah, there's many ways to Mormon. I'll work to be brief. I had many transcendent connecting experiences in my life. And I had what I perceived was an answer to prayer with words that were almost audible to me. Whether that's elevation emotion or what that is, serendipity, Jungian universal consciousness, I don't know. But what I did do is, in late 2017, I traveled back to my mission in Barcelona, Spain. And because I needed to make sense of what happened there. And I went to state conference. I served in one ward for 13 months. And we had a lot of success there. And I became part of the ward to the extent that they gave me a farewell when I left for my mission. And the ward mission leader became the stake president, and people that I baptized ended up in ward and stake leadership too. And I was really connected to those people. I kept those relationships. So I went back and I went to stake conference, and it was the first time I had been back to church since August of 2016. And I sensed what I used to call the spirit when the Stake Relief Society president, who was my first baptism in that area, talked. And I looked around me and I saw people reacting to what she was saying. And then the mission president got up and talked about the word of wisdom. I think he might have been from Ogden or something, a retired doctor. And the things that he was saying about the word of wisdom were completely inaccurate. It was wrong. But the people around me, I noticed, were sensing spirit. So that was pretty blunt about how spiritual experiences are not reliable divine confirmations of truth. But I saw a devotion to the divine. Within the following about week and a half, we went to Tarragona and we saw Roman ruins in devotion to feminine divine. We went to the Sagrada Familia and we saw centuries of devotion to divine through the paradigm of the Catholic Church. We went to a medieval town called Besalú that was north of Barcelona, a little bit of a drive, that had an old Jewish quarter with ritual bathing baths that went underground during the Inquisition. It wasn't refound until the Spanish Civil War in the 1900s. And I witnessed all this spectrum of devotion to divine. And as we were about to come home, Reza Aslan's new book called God, Human History came out, where he talks about the history of humans experiencing things and then attributing meaning to those things. And anthropomorphizing characteristics of the divine to make it more relatable. And he talked about Christianity and polytheism and monotheism and so forth. And then at the end of his book, he talked about what's referred to as pantheism, which Richard Dawkins calls sexed up atheism, which is the idea that perhaps there's an omnipresent animating force that exists in and all through things, that's not an interventionist creator God being, but that we're a part of a greater organism. And that chapter felt kind of didactic to me, so I pushed back on it because I didn't want to be prescribed anything. But it actually did kind of resonate a little bit with my experience. And I noticed that many of the progressive Christians like Richard Rohr and Rob Bell and John Shelby Spong and Rachel Held Evans before she passed away and others had shifted towards more of a pantheistic view or panentheistic or panintheistic. There's like different. But they spoke in the vocabulary of in the hero's journey where they returned to their community, healed from the trauma, but not the same as their community anymore, kind of thing. So where I've landed, I'm comfortable using the word God now, and to me, it's not an interventionist creator God, but it's an experience of transcendent connection. When I witness beauty, meaning, and goodness in nature in this moment, with that 17-year-old holding me, with Ken Peterson letting me know, with my friend telling me that what I was going to do was bullshit, and told me that I needed to do what I did instead. So I haven't joined another church. I've church hopped, but I experience transcendent connection in a variety of different places, and I don't need the identity currently of a faith community to experience that.
First of all, I just want to thank you. I was on the Mixed Faith Marriage Moat group, and you responded to some of my posts, and it was really helpful.
Thank you.
My marriage did not last the faith crisis, but it's getting longer, but I wanted to thank you for that. If you feel so comfortable sharing, have you chosen to resign? Why or why not? And how is your son doing, and your wife with all of your public? I know you talked a little bit about a moat, but if you feel comfortable addressing those.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm a little bit over optimistic sometimes, and so I thought that if Dan Witherspoon and Thomas McConkie and others can come up with a reconstructed faith, certainly I can. And it shouldn't have to take decades and decades like it did for them. For my hero's journey would be much, much shorter. And so after about 18 months from my crash, I had largely processed the grief and wasn't revisiting it on a regular basis. But I had this underlying sense of anxiety that I needed to figure out how I could return to my community, because I missed those people. I love them, and I experienced significant meaning and connection in my community. And then Elder Ballard, who I've met personally because his son was one of my closest friends when I was in grad school, Craig. I've been in his home. I've been in Elder Ballard's office. When Elder Ballard in the November 2017 face-to-face said, "There's never ever been any attempt to suppress or hide difficult information from the beginning of time. You just need to trust us on this." I felt like that was too far. And because I believe from his prepared notes when he said that, I believe that he knew he was intentionally lying. And that was too much. And I wanted to believe that they were men just doing the best that they could. And I still think that. But that was a blatant lie to me. And that's how I viewed it. And so I struggled for about a month. And in December of 2017, I used Quit Mormon to resign, to set a boundary for me and for my local leaders, who are my friends to this day. And part of that also was I felt like it was time to begin meeting with our local Mormon Spectrum group, and I didn't want to be threatened with discipline if I supported other people. And they chose not a faithful reconciliation. So in January of 2018, my resignation was final. My son is doing great. He and his partner have been together for 6.5 years. They live in North Logan. They both work for Microsoft as software engineers. They're doing fantastic. My son's partner has resigned. My son hasn't. So if I ever want to use LDS tools, I won't confess to that. My daughter lives with her never Mormon boyfriend of a few years here in the Utah area. So my wife is the only one left, and she's first counselor in the Relief Society presidency, and she's a temple ordinance worker. And she experiences divinity in her participation in the church. She thrives. And she is much more nuanced than I ever understood her to be. We were in a mixed faith marriage even when I was a believer, and I didn't realize that. So her story is her story to tell. She's a very private person. And so I won't tell her story. But the biggest breakthrough for us is we learned that we had shared spiritual languages, shared things that were meaningful to us, service to others. Krista Tippett's On Being podcast, Jack Kornfield's Buddhism for Beginners, Eckhart Tolle, Brian McLaren's How to See podcast, things like that. So there are things that we can share, and there are things that we can't share. And a few years ago, it was before COVID, we really came to the reconciliation that we needed to stop trying to make okay what's not okay, Because it's never going to be okay to me that she chooses not to unpack church history. And it's never going to be okay to her that I'm public and she's private and I'm out here talking about the church in ways that are potentially critical. But we chose for it to be okay, but it's not okay because we want to be together. And neither of us could tell you in 3 or 5 years if that's still going to be the case, but that's what we choose today. And we made that choice. Our marriage all of a sudden became the best that it ever was. So everyone kind of has to renegotiate their marital relationship, I think, if it was based on a paradigm that crumbled. And sometimes it doesn't stay. And ours isn't the same marriage that it was before either. Do I have any regrets for resigning? I don't think so. I mean, there have been times that I thought that maybe I didn't need to set that hard of a boundary. I could have just thrown my temple recommend at my bishop and then would have been happy or something. But it's been very freeing to do and go where I feel connection or potentially led to go without any concern that I would be threatened to be shamed by my friends. That would probably be a traumatic experience for me. So I don't.
I just want to say I really appreciate how much you've shared, how making yourself vulnerable and being open to those moments has been healing for you and so many people that you've come in contact with. And you've started now, in the answer to the last question, to talk about what I hoped you would more, the tool set you're developing for navigating the dangerous waters when you're with someone who doesn't want to be vulnerable, when you're with an Orthodox LDS person with whom you disagree fundamentally about important things, just how you navigate conversations with someone that you value and love, and you want to build a relationship and not harm it. But what have you learned in the last few years?
Thanks. Wow, that would be an 1.5 hour long session by itself, 2 or 3 parts. What I would say is, first, I'm actually going to launch a new podcast beginning this month. I decided to, and it's going to be called Life After Deconstruction. And the basic premise of it, and sorry if these words are too triggering, I need to figure out a better way to say it. After a person has processed the trauma and the grief of a faith crisis, I feel like the next step is to strive to manifest the fruits of the Spirit in your life. Whatever that means. Even if it's secular. Because if we do those kinds of things, those activities, it's going to be meaningful for us, but it also our believing friends and family are going to feel what they refer to as the Spirit when they're around us. And so whether it's service to others, whether it's extending grace, whatever combination of those things, that will help because they'll feel less threatened. Because the dominant narrative is that when someone loses belief, they're under Satan's power. And when they see us in deep grief and raging and processing trauma, that looks a hell of a lot like Satan, doesn't it? Yeah, it's changed countenance. And it feeds into the narrative, and it's destabilizing for them, and they have fear. So part of it is to live your best life, to manifest goodness in your life. And the second part is to find what those shared languages are. So if it's you decide that the Christmas activity this year is to find out what charities buy shoes for kids, and what you're going to do is a drive to accumulate shoes for kids, and you invite them into that experience, those kinds of things. Then there are some fantastic books. There's a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations. There's Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. There's Brian McLaren's Learning How to See. There are several others that are helpful. And what my experience and recommendation is is to find relationships with people who you vehemently disagree with and practice on them. So you get better at it. So that when you're around people you really care about the relationship, you can do better. So anyway.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for sharing with us this deeply personal experience. But I'd just like to talk, though, about the religious framework. Really, we live in a world where many of the religious traditions are descended from an age of autocracy. Here are our doctrines. You must accept all of this. And if you don't, you're a heretic. Jan Hus, burnt at the stake.
Yes.
600 years ago. Martin Luther escaped that fate, but was a heretic because he didn't accept everything. And you've been so kind in your evaluation of the religious end of this, really focusing on your personal experience. But it would seem, I'd like to hear if you have any thoughts about whether the religion itself, with its body of doctrine, might have some problems in its approach to it, that the members who find themselves not in total agreement with everything in it don't have to feel a ton of shame and guilt.
Thank you. That is a big question, too. You'll notice in my talk, there are a few things that I did. Like I said, I only mentioned Mormon in the first sentence. The next thing I did is I explained the coupling of experiences, the meaning I attributed to God, my identity, my community. It was all coupled together. And through the process of my talk, I decoupled all of those things. But still, at the end of my talk, I honored each of those decoupled things, right? So I think part of it is to realize that some of these things are enduring because there are good things in them. Like, my mission was good and bad, but I am who I am because of my mission. What my community did for us when we were poor, when my father couldn't provide for us, that was a big thing. So I think there is a reason that religious traditions build kind of a community. I understand that tribal is not a correct word to use, but a family-based support system that then gets enmeshed with patriarchy and control and manipulation and abuse and othering and stuff like that. And so I think it's complicated. I think the answer is it's a both and answer. I think there's very significant unhealthiness there, and there's significant unhealthiness in ex-Mormon Reddit, and there's significant unhealthiness in even the best things. And so I think it's really complicated. I think David Osler kind of alluded to this in his session yesterday, is that the younger generation is putting up with less of that crap. And so the way human evolution works is it doesn't move very fast, and maybe we're generations or centuries away from being in a healthier place, but I think that is the trajectory. My sense is I personally think that this experience of faith crisis is probably around 3% per year of otherwise active believing members, people on the ward and state council and so forth, and that over the next 10 to 15 years, maybe 1 million members across the Rocky Mountain states that are Orthodox believing members now are going to go through what I went through to some degree. And the question is who's going to minister to them? Is the church going to retrench? Big church, little C church, big C church, little C church, are they going to retrench? Are they going to be defensive and divisive? Or are they going to minister to those people? And if they aren't going to minister to those people, who's going to minister from the outside of the edge? Those are the questions that are of most interest to me, because I think religion is going to do to itself what it's going to do with regardless of what we do from the outside and the critics. And generationally, it's going to change. Okay.
I will be quick. Okay, so born and raised in AUB, fundamentalism. And they are a very afraid group. And I've worked really hard to be able to do the process of seeing It's like becoming awake to the dark aspects of the community, and to then go through that process of the loss and the healing. And I'm in the space where I've turned around and I'm endeavoring to represent something different, but still love. That I'm not hijacked by my wounds so that they define my being, but that I embody love for them. So with my honey, we go to church, AUB style, with all the guards who follow us around, and endeavor to just love each person that we see. And we're apostates. We went through the endowment. We're going to hell. We get outer darkness. We don't get to exist after this, right? And yet we embody love for them, and we say hi to them. And I'm in a space where I'm dancing in a room that has a lot of darkness, a lot of fear. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on the space of stepping back. I don't believe it, not for 1 second. That's not why I'm there. I'm there because I love them. I understand their worldview. What's the advice that you would have to support someone in stepping back in to represent what you are, and being able to simply be a bridge person for those who might need assistance?
Thanks for that question. So in the hero's journey, when the hero leaves the sick community and goes out, whether it's Bilbo Baggins or Luke Skywalker or whoever, and they heal themselves, and then they eventually return to their community, whether it's on the inside or outside the edge. In order for that to work, they need enough time away to heal themselves. Because if they go back before they're healed, they're going to get sick again. And so sometimes it takes moderation to not be re-traumatized. Maybe you only go once every now and then. So listen to what your body is telling you. If you go to church and your heart is racing and you're about to have a panic attack, your body is telling you that you should not be there. So the hero's journey is complicated. Last question.
Thanks, Anthony, for being so vulnerable. Could you give us some of the mechanics of what you use in your successful support group in Billings?
Yes. The first thing I did is I tried to make it not look too Mormon. So my co-leader is Sarah Hughes Zabawa. She's a therapist. Unfortunately, it makes it look like I'm the high priest group leader and she's the Relief Society president. But what I can say is when we do in-person meetups, generally the women outnumber the men by a large percentage. And that tells me at least we're doing something right in terms of breaking down the patriarchy. We have a monthly meetup. It's usually like a Thursday evening or something. Sometimes we'll do a Saturday afternoon meetup. We have a private Facebook group where we have conversations with an understanding that the membership of the group and the discussions are to be held completely confidential without explicit permission otherwise. We vet people before they come in the group to make sure we're not going to introduce them to faith crisis. We are really good at ministering presence, holding the hand of a stranger. We're really good at supporting people in those processing trauma and grief stages. And then what tends to happen is organically, the members of the group kind of create subgroups for post-growth. So our primary focus of the group isn't to prescribe, this is what life after deconstruction should look like. It's more of we're gonna support people. We're gonna see how are you doing. We're gonna have closer conversations. And generally, even though our group is over 90 people now, usually when we have meetups, it's 15 or fewer people, so you can have intimate conversations about tender things.
That's how it is now. In the future, once our group is in the multiple hundreds of size, I think we'll probably figure out how to break it into smaller groups, because I think to have the intimacy of being seen in your story takes a smaller group. I think that's how we'll do that. Thank you.